Now I'm going to assume most of you kind of know how Kafka works, so we're going to skip that portion. If you guys don't really know how she works, I highly recommend you check out my build guide video on Kafka, which will be out as soon as she releases as well. But first things first, I think the DOT teams that everyone is really concerned and people want to play. Some of you are asking, how many characters do you need for a DOT team? 2, 3, 4? What is the ideal? I think first of all, like the best character to synergize currently as of version 1.2 with Kafka is going to be Sampo. Most people will probably be able to get by in terms of the AoE damage that is being done just by these two characters alone. You could of course get away with like some other characters in the last 2 slot. If you really want to push it like a little bit more DPS in terms of like a DOT element, I think that a single target is going to be really strong is of course Luca. Luca gives basically what Sampo as well as Kafka lack, which is going to be a lot of single target damage. For those of you maybe don't feel much problems with single target, maybe there's more like AoE damage, Serval is definitely going to be a good choice in your pivot slot, depending on like, are you facing more AoE content, or maybe are you perhaps like facing more single target content. So that will be my decision criteria between these two. Not to worry if any of you maybe don't have all these characters, I'm going to talk about like free to play options in a little bit as well. As for the utility part here, I think the character that works best in terms of like sustain will be March 7 at high Eidolons. At E6, March 7 heals. She can use also the trend of Universal Market, gonna be very effective in proccing DOT even from a defensive role. Of course, again, this is like purely from a DOT standpoint, a DOT team standpoint. So this is gonna be one option. For those of you who don't have a March 7 at like high Eidolons, of course, a free to play option will definitely be Natasha. Any other healer really works well. You can put like Bailu, you can put Fire MC if you run here maybe with a second sustain character. You could of course have Luo Ta, Japat. They all should work pretty well. But out of all of them, I definitely do prefer E6 March 7 just because of the amount of freeze she adds on the battlefield. As you know, once you freeze units and once they unfreeze, they actually get like sort of like a speed buff, which procs DOT much more often. I think it's quite useful as well. For those of you who are interested in like a DOT mechanics guide, I actually have it already done on the channel. It's called like What Affects Damage Over Time DOT guide. Check it out if you're interested. I think it's going to be super useful for any of us who are trying to like explore a little bit more on damage over time. Other than that, I think the next question that you want to know is, if you don't care too much about a triple DOT team, which in my opinion I think is probably going to be ideal, the best character or the best support buffer for Kafka and Sampo, or Kafka and whoever else you're playing in a DOT, maybe you want to play Luca here, or maybe you want to play Serval in this slot if you don't like Sampo's design or anything, like you want to play a full waifu team or something like that. I think that in the pivot slot here, probably the best harmony character out of the 4 that we have is probably going to have to be Esta. I think Esta works super well. She gives attack buffs to the entire team, speed buffs. She has a little bit of burn in her auto attacks, but that's not the main reason. But other than that, she's a fantastic character, attack buffs, which is really what DOT scales off with, rather than the crit, which a lot of the other characters give. Tingyun also, for example, is only a single target buffing, and as we know, for example, if we saw this video that we had here, there's damage over time snapshot. If you haven't, or you are interested to figure out, snapshot is basically like, does the damage once you apply the DOT, is that like the standardized, like fixed all throughout, or does it fluctuate with the buffs that you are being provided? If you're interested in the like more nitty gritty, check that out. We covered that already on the channel, so I won't talk about it again because it's like talking about the same thing. So that is like, in my opinion, like a very strong DOT team that you can consider. Another option is if you don't want to go through a support attack buffer like Esta, you can definitely highly consider a defense shredder. For example, like Pella, we talked about it in our DOT guide video. Defense shred does affect damage over time, and by reducing the enemy's defense, you don't really care what your team scales off with, so you can bypass like the attack buffing category, especially if you need maybe a bit of shredding instead. You need a bit of freeze when Pella breaks and stuff like that. So that is like another angle of looking at things. Now, for those of you who don't give two shits about DOT, I think the other option that you can go for is a traditional crit Kafka. I do think, like, I'm going to put it out real quick, that crit Kafka might feel a bit lackluster compared to a crit Jingyuan, who really competes in the same category, especially in this slot. So, but some of you maybe don't really care too much about DOT. Maybe you don't like the characters like Sampo, you don't really like Luca that much in his design, and you want to go more traditional. I think it's possible as well. I'll give you towards the end of the video like my preferred build or my preferred team comp that I'm going to be running Kafka as how I played it and how I like it. But here I'm going to just share with you, if you wanted to build traditional crit, what you should look out for. If you are building Kafka for a traditional crit, you definitely want to play her in a more of an AoE DPS role. In that sense, your synergy here is most likely going to be a single target DPS. For example, like Zila here, you can play Yanqing, you can play Su Sang, you can play Dan Heng. These characters generally work pretty well in a single target. You could of course run Blade. This is like, for example, your Stellaron Hunter team comp. You could even run, for example, like Silver Wolf in this slot for a slight debuffing category. So Blade is going to be like your single target with a bit of splash. Kafka is going to be your AoE plus a little bit of single target when she follow-ups in that sense. I think this will be more of like a traditional build that you can follow. So here's like your AoE DPS, here's your single target DPS, and here's going to be your buffer or debuffer. In that case, if you are running Blade, I think a debuffer will be better since she skills off with attack, he skills off mostly with HP, and a defense shredder doesn't care what they skill off with because you're just putting the debuffs on the enemy. If you don't really have a preference, you don't really know what to do, I think that attack buffer still works fine. You could run any of the attack buffers currently because it's a traditional crit build. You can run Bronya, but she doesn't really benefit too much from hyper carry. So the question is like, who are you running in your second slot? That is the question that you want to ask when deciding who is going to be your support attack buffer. These 4 characters, harmony characters that we have in the game, vary very differently. We talked about it in another video, especially on the channel, also talking about the different harmony characters, who is better for who. You can check other team comp guide videos on this character specifically. But I'll just leave it at that. I'm just going to leave this here. For any of you who is following the dialogue and not skipping, you will know why like I put this towards the bottom and this one blank. But in terms of the utility one, I think it's pretty much standardized. There are no characters that work like super well with Kafka in a sense. She has a bit of tankiness in her kit, she has a bit of sustain in terms of HP traces. She's not very squishy if you look at her stat distribution. She moves quite fast overall, and I think she can take a few hits or two, and most of the team comps don't really care about a thick shielder, for example like Japat, so he's not a huge necessity. In that sense, I think you can get by with like a free-to-play Natasha if you wanted to. You can get by with like Luota, Bailu. Pretty flexible in terms of the options you have in terms of your utility slot in general. Next up, let's talk about like a free-to-play team before we go into my favorite team as well. This is when like you don't have any 5-star limited characters. Maybe you are just like you skip every single banner, so all you're left with is like free-to-play characters and maybe E6, for example, Kafka and stuff like that. I want to give you a team comp for her also. I don't want to just leave you out because no one will create content for free-to-play teams purely at this stage of the game. So I think first of all, if you have maybe high Eidolons, same, I think she's probably going to be the best, March 7. But most of you, if you are in a free-to-play team, you probably won't have her at high Eidolons. In that case, I'll recommend you sticking with a character like Natasha in the utility slot. And as for your pivot slot, I think Asta, who is free, is going to be like the best bet. Tons of value for your account as well. I think that this team composition will likely be more or less okay. Some DOT here, some AoE here. Good amounts of attack buffing, speed buffing. In your second slot here, because we are specifically looking for like a free-to-play team only, I think you have 2 options. Your first option will be physical MC. Physical MC is decent here as well because you already have a decent sustain in your 4th slot, especially if you are slightly like more advanced in the game. Everyone's like level 80. You probably won't get one-shotted as well if your Natasha is pretty well built overall. I think that another option that you can choose if you're purely free to play, of course, is Dan Heng, depending on what is your choice overall. One thing to note is that she doesn't really like the hyper carry, for example, playing Yukong as well as Asta here, because she doesn't scale too well with like crit rate, crit damage, with multipliers being much smaller than other traditional crit DPSs. So there's like just some things to consider. If you have multiple characters, I think this slot is the one that can improve the most. You could probably throw in like a Han character here to improve this slot. Su Sang likely will work the best, but of course she's not free to play. I'm just mentioning it because any of you who have her probably can run this team comp quite well as long as you have a decent here in the 4th slot. Now, this is the part that I'm most excited for. So what's my personal bias and what are the team comps I'm going to be running? I already have a video on the channel. It's actually called a Speed Kafka video. I talked about it, for example, I showcased Zila and Kafka together in the same team, building Kafka for very high speed. For those of you who don't exactly know like the mechanics of speed, why does speed matter, we recently posted on the channel like a couple of videos ago a simple and easy speed guide exactly telling you like how these numbers appear and what they mean, what are the most efficient ratios, and how speed also has diminishing return. I highly recommend you check that out if you're not too sure about speed yet. But anyway, my team that I'm going to be running in the first half or most of the time is going to be a Zealer as well as Kafka combo. The reason why I think these two work really well together is Zealer is single target with a bit of AoE. Kafka is a lot of AoE with some single target damage instances as well. They combo well in this sense because they cover each other in terms of both being like AoE and single target in that sense. The pivot and utility is going to be pretty flexible. I am personally going to run Esta in the pivot slot, as well as in my last slot, utility slot, I'm probably going to run Natasha. This is what I ran in the closed beta test, the beta test as well, and I like it a lot. I auto battle with this almost every single match that I have so far. Likely I probably will be bringing it to me in this current game state as well. Very, very solid because you have good flexible characters that can be swapped out very easily. I can put the speed set on her, giving my whole team more speed. I can put the crit damage set here, the one with broken kill, the new sets that are out, giving my whole team even more crit damage. A good attack buff from Esta, good speed buffs from Esta, which she benefits from because if I'm building her, for example, with attack boots, at least I have that huge speed to make use of her S1 light cone as well. And yeah, so that is my thought process. I think speed definitely capitalizes on, for example, Esta. And at this point, I think a lot of you might be wondering the speed and crit ratios and all that stuff. So I highly recommend you, for example, check out these other video that we have on the channel. Talks about how much crit should you actually put on characters. Otherwise, do check out, for example, the speed video that we talked about. I think it'll be very, very useful as well for those of you who just want to know a bit more mechanics as we are getting into the game. And thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe for more of such future Honkai style content. See you in the next video.